How to photograph astrophotography. There's so many different ways to take photos of the night sky, whether you're just taking photos of the stars or you're photographing the Milky Way above a massive ridge line. Matt with B&H here, and in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to photograph the Milky Way and astrophotography in general. We'll talk about how to prepare to take your photos, the gear necessary to take astrophotography as well. We'll talk about the settings to get the best results for astrophotography, and then we'll head into post-processing where I'll show you exactly how I edit some of my astro photographs. So let's get into it. So when it comes to astrophotography, a lot of it comes down to the planning stages. You want to make sure that you're aiming for a region and a part of the world where you know that the Milky Way is going to align with the scene that you're trying to photograph. This all depends on the hemisphere that you're on, the season that it is, and the exact time that you're at a location. Another major thing to consider is going to be the phase of the moon. Aiming for a new moon means that you're going to get the darkest night sky. However, it means that you might have a darker foreground. So if you're trying to maybe photograph a tree or a building or even just a vast landscape, well, the moon would ordinarily light the whole entire scene. But if it's a new moon, you're not going to have that, but you're going to have brighter stars. So it really depends on the scene that you're going for, on whether you want a new moon or maybe somewhere in between a full moon and a new moon. For the most part, aiming for an actual better astrophotography photo, a new moon is going to be the best because we can always add light to our scene by shining a light on it or taking a longer exposure of the scene and stacking that in post-processing. This time of year, as you can tell, it is fall and absolutely beautiful in this region around this time. And my favorite part about that is also because the Milky Way actually lines up much earlier, so I don't have to stay out until 5 a.m. as I ordinarily would do if I'm photographing the Milky Way, which is another perk of making sure that I'm finding the right season and time to photograph the Milky Way. So how do you actually figure out where the Milky Way is going to be before your trip? I love to use the PhotoPills app because it tells you exactly where the Milky Way is going to be long ahead of time on the exact date and the exact part of the world that you're in. I can make sure that I'm happy with my composition long before I actually show up to the area where I'm trying to photograph. And that way I'm not fumbling with my camera trying to find a composition when it's pitch black out. And that also means that I could see the location and anything that might be a danger in the daytime, because you don't want to go to an area where maybe there's a cliff edge 10 feet out. That's super dangerous, so scouting your location also is a safety precaution. Light pollution is another major factor and consideration that you want to completely avoid if possible. You can use resources like dark sky finders online that will actually tell you areas where you can avoid any of that light pollution. And this area is actually perfect for that. There's not many major cities nearby that would cause light pollution. But you'll notice in your final photos, if you have light pollution, well, one, the stars probably won't be as bright if you're near somewhere like New York City, which makes it hard to photograph the Milky Way over the B&H Superstore. But finding an area where there's absolutely no light pollution is going to provide the best astro photos and make your stars extra bright. And another major reason that you want to scout your location in the daytime is you can see if there's going to be any foot traffic that's going to cause a problem. So if there's a path going through where you're planning to shoot your astrophotography, then that might bring some people with headlamps later on that night. And overall, you just want to avoid anybody with headlamps, including if you're with anybody. Now that we're properly prepared to photograph our scene, we know the best settings, when the Milky Way is going to line up perfectly, I think we're ready to actually head out into the field. Wait, no we're not. We need the lights to go out. So we're gonna wait for sunset, maybe get some nice images of that, and then we're gonna head out into the field. So I'll see you guys out there. All right, the stage is set, the lights are out, it's time to photograph the Milky Way. We found this awesome composition in this field here that we drove past. We're like, all right, that lone tree over there in that field looks really epic. We whipped out PhotoPills and noticed that it would line up with the Milky Way in such a beautiful way tonight at around 10 p.m. So thankfully not too late of a night, but the night is still young. We'll see if we photograph other compositions later. Let's talk about my settings here and the gear that I'm using. Right now, I'm on the Sony a7S III for those low light benefits, trying to avoid noise in this image. And I'm using the Tamron 20 to 40 mil. It's a 2.8 lens and it's been handling this scene really well in some of my test photos. Composition wise, I'm framing that tree in the center with the Milky Way going above it on the left of frame. You could potentially put the Milky Way behind the tree, but I think it would look too busy, especially because it's a dead tree, and then it's going to hide some of those stars behind it, so I would avoid that. It's better to have the Milky Way adjacent to our subject or coming from our subject in an interesting way like this scene. For my settings, I determined my shutter speed based off my focal length and the camera that I'm using. So I used the NPF rule, and I actually plugged this right into the PhotoPills app, and I went to star points. Once I put in my camera focal length, which I'm using 20 millimeters right now, it told me that I can get away with a 16-second shutter, and that would get me nice, sharp star points. The reason that this is so important to make sure that you're checking your shutter speed with that rule is because the wider you are, the longer your shutter speed that you can go for, because we're so far away from the stars. If we increase that focal length, we're essentially magnifying those stars, and because of that, we're going to see the motion of those stars in our image. We want to avoid that, unless of course we're photographing star trails. For my aperture, I would aim regardless for the fastest that you can go with your aperture. On this lens, I can go to 2.8, and that's what I'm photographing this scene at. For my ISO, I'm at around 3200 right now. Anywhere between 1250 and 3200 tends to get the job done in most cases. If you can go lower than that, even better. And yes, this lens is a 2.8 lens. The question often comes up, is 2.8 good enough for astrophotography? Am I going to get enough light hitting that sensor? And the answer is yes, 2.8 is relatively fast, and it'll get the job done for most astrophotography circumstances. For my focus, I'm switching to manual focus because in astrophotography, pretty much any camera out there is going to have a hard time automatically focusing on a scene that is as dark as this. This is extreme darkness right now, which we want for a Milky Way photo. However, that means that we're going to have to manual focus. So to do this, I'm using a focus magnifier on my camera, which essentially zooms in to those stars. So I pull those stars into frame, and then they look like a big blob at first. And basically, I just adjust the focus until it's a really, really tiny, sharp point. And then I know that my stars are in perfect focus. For my white balance, I like to aim for a more bluer Milky Way, and for that reason, I'm around 3700 Kelvin right now. You can go for really whatever suits your taste, and the best part about this is if we're shooting in RAW, we can always change this in post-production. I'm also shooting with a 2-second delay because I don't want to introduce any shake into the camera since we're photographing a long exposure here, and I don't want to hit the tripod in any way, and I don't want the camera shaking in any way because that'll definitely mess up our image. Anyways, I think we're gonna hit the lights out. I'm gonna make sure that nobody is shining any headlamps around. Let's see what photos we can capture. All right, these photos are looking pretty awesome, and I can't wait to edit them. With that in mind, let's head inside for some post-processing. All right, well, we are back inside, nice and warm, and I'm so excited to dive in to this astro edit. So just taking a look at some of the exposures that I took, this was a little bit later into the night. Sadly, the clouds rolled in, which is really unfortunate because we probably would have stayed out till like 5 a.m. just photographing the Milky Way all night. But I just took that picture really to see what the stars were looking like and how much cloud coverage there truly was, because it was a little dark to even see what was a cloud and what wasn't. So yeah, that ended up happening, unfortunately. But jumping to the scene in the field where we had the tree in the center of our composition, I basically took this exposure to start off just to get my bearings, so to speak, and really see what the Milky Way was looking like. It was still a little early, so we weren't getting that vivid of a Milky Way, and it definitely didn't look that fantastic just yet, but only 30 minutes later, not even, and it was completely dark, and it just looked beautiful. This is also a good way to kind of see what light pollution is happening in the area and how that'll affect your final image. So then jumping to our tree photo, we had another composition that was a little bit further back, about 50 feet back from where our final composition was, and we moved forward to try and separate the tree from the ridge line of the mountains, and I think that helped to actually make the tree stand out and look a lot better. So looking at little things like that, how the background cuts into your main subject, definitely can help with your compositions. Speaking of composition, I did both a horizontal and a vertical version of this photo. I started with a horizontal shot, and I quickly realized that a vertical was going to be quite a bit better for a Milky Way shot, especially this one where it was straight up and down in our frame, And of course, that just lends itself more to a vertical composition, and that looked far better in my opinion. So this shot was with the A7S III and the Tamron 20 to 40 mil at 20 millimeters. My ISO was at 3200 f2.8 and a 15-second long exposure, and I think it looks really clean overall when it comes to any kind of noise. And of course, the detail out of that Tamron absolutely nailed it. So to start off, I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of dehaze because it was getting increasingly cloudy throughout the night. It didn't affect our final photo, but I'm going to go ahead and start with that. And then I'm going to jump into using some of our masks here. I'm going to select the sky and actually invert that so that I can select the tree and the foreground here, and I'm going to bring up the exposure on that. Now, the dynamic range here was so great that I didn't even have to take multiple exposures. It could have been extra light coming in from nearby light pollution or something like that. It is a new moon, so we didn't have that benefit. But still, it handled this so well, and I got a nice, even foreground exposure. I did light it with my phone just slightly. I must have held it there for maybe 2 seconds, just using the flashlight on my phone, and it seemed to work really well. And because of that light, it gave it somewhat of a vignette on the bottom here, which I also really like because it helps draw more attention towards that tree in the middle. So now I'm going to add a mask and actually choose my sky this time. And what I'm going to start doing here is first add some contrast, bring up our exposure a little bit, and then also dehaze this. And then I feel I was a little bit blue on my white balance and a little bit towards the magenta hue. And then I'm going to add some contrast to the overall image as well. Come back to our sky mask, see what that did so far. And as you can tell, we have quite a bit of light pollution on the bottom here. It could have been the sunset still fading out, or it could have been a nearby city. And so what I'm going to do to combat this is add another sky layer and then intersect that with a linear gradient coming from the bottom here. Then I'm going to add a little bit of contrast, a magenta tint, because naturally that is a little too green on the tint and that light pollution. And then also a little bit of blue. Whoa, that's too much. So we're good on the right side here, but I'm going to add a little bit more just with a brush on the left. And then because it added quite a bit of haze from that pollution there, I'm going to also dehaze it slightly. Sweet. Now from there, I want to bring out that Milky Way even more. So I'm going to add a brush tool, a brush mask right here over the Milky Way. And I'm going to actually warm this up a little bit just to bring out some of the brown that naturally comes out of that Milky Way and bring up the saturation on that slightly, as well as add a little bit of clarity just to highlight some of those stars there. I still think we're a little too warm on the bottom left half of the sky, so I'm going to take away some of that warmth out of our white balance here. And then there's quite a bit of a gradient that is getting pretty dark at the top of the image, so I'm going to brighten that up as well. Just slightly. Then add slightly more contrast and bring our exposure up some more. Well, I think that looks pretty gnarly. So I'm happy with the sky. I'm going to move to the tree a little bit because I think it's a little bit underexposed here. So I'm going to add a brush just to the trees in the background just to bring them up slightly so they're not completely dark. Then I'm going to add a radial gradient around the tree here just to draw more attention towards the center of the photo. Adjusting the horizon level just slightly. Another thing is if you get any discrepancies in your photos, like I have a satellite flying through here, it looks like, I could take that out by using the erase remove tool, the stamp tool, things like that. But I'm going to leave it in. Personally, I don't mind having that in there. I think it's kind of cool, and it was passing by when I was taking the picture, so I'm going to leave it in there. Last but not least, I'm going to do some denoise AI in the Lightroom software here. It always handles these images so well. In the past, it sometimes was a problem with astrophotography and denoise software taking out stars and whatnot, but this is absolutely fantastic with how it handles astro photos now. And I already have a super clean image that I'm starting from, so that's fantastic. Using a zoom and at f2.8, it's super impressive how little noise we got in this photo. So let's go ahead and add some denoise here. You can kind of see what effect it's having on the image. I'm going to bring down the amount just slightly. Now this will turn your photo into a DNG, so I would recommend kind of doing this as your last step before finalizing your photo. And this is our final result. Well, I'm super stoked about this final image. We had so much fun exploring the night sky and photographing it with those beautiful Tamron lenses, which absolutely nailed it for this scene, especially at the 2.8 that we shot it at. Hey, you don't need the fastest lens in the world, and I think this is truly a testament to that. But what did you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below if you have any questions about what we talked about in this video and where you plan to photograph the night sky. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Matt, and I'll see you next time.